Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2023 Global Ivey Day Power Lunch. I was asking somebody just before this why it's called the Power Lunch, and I don't know if there's a really clear reason, but when I think of an institution that's 100 years old, when I think of a school that's able to host more than 30 events around the world in celebration of Global Ivey Day, where people like this all come together to celebrate a shared experience. And when I think of the power of Ivey in transforming people's lives professionally and personally, I think Power Lunch feels like a very apt description. My name is Lisa Diamond, and I'm chair of the Ivey Alumni Network. And Global Ivey Day was founded in 2010 by the Ivey Alumni Network and is really about reconnecting with friends, colleagues, classmates, old and new. I had the opportunity at a senior alumni, and yes, I qualified for a senior alumni event this morning. There was lots of familiar faces and lots of new faces as well, and lots of hands of people who said this was their first Global Ivey Day event, and it really motivated them to continue to engage in new ways. So it's terrific to see so many of you here today. Before we dive into the Power Lunch conversation, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathering today on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is now home to many diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are here for a very special conversation today to recognize the recipients of this year's Ivey Alumni Achievement Award. And let me tell you what a wonderfully powerful story this is. This is a story of vision, of perseverance, and of friendship. Dave Dabrowski and John Stelzer, both HBA 2004, are co-founders and partners of Solon Capital Partners. And before we get into the conversation with them, let me tell you a little bit about Solon. Solon is a West Africa-focused investment manager that is pioneering a new approach to economic development and poverty reduction in fragile and post-conflict states. Very different than what those of us who work on Bay Street are experiencing. Solon has built businesses across various sectors, and I'll tell you about a few of them. Rising Academy Network, a quality-focused, affordable schools business. West Africa Blue, which partners with local communities to preserve, restore, and sustainably manage coastal ecosystems across West Africa, and is financed through the issuance of high-quality carbon credits. Flash Vehicles, a vehicle leasing and fleet management business servicing primarily international companies and NGOs, and HC Capital Properties, a builder of sustainable communities, and which issued Francophone Africa's first green bond. A huge, huge collection of impact. Altogether, Solon's businesses directly and measurably impact the lives of over 44,000 people through full-time jobs, education, skills training, and the results have really been staggering. Starting from one school in 2015, Rising now reaches nearly 1,000 schools and 300,000 children across Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ghana, Uganda, and Rwanda. And in Sierra Leone, 94% of students from Rising's private schools who sat the National Primary School Examination finished in the top 10% of students nationally, and 16% of the school students finished in the top 1%. West Africa Blue's first project in Sierra Leone covers over 140,000 hectares, making it the largest blue carbon conversion project in the world. And The Economist has named the organization one of 12 organizations globally who are delivering on the promise of blue carbon. Absolutely outstanding impact. I'll now hand it over to Dean Sharon Hodgson. Sharon, Dave, John, come to the stage, but in closing, I just want to say how proud we can all be to share the Ivey brand with these two alumni. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to make sure, yeah? You guys can hear me in the back of the room? Excellent, thank you. All right, well, thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody to Global Ivey Day. This is actually my first Global Ivey Day in person since being dean, even though I've been dean for 4 years now. So it's exciting to see so many people here in person. And to Dave and John, congratulations, the Ivey Alumni Achievement Award. You certainly are an amazing reflection of what we hope to be demonstrating as great Ivey grads, and I'm really, really happy that you were able to make it here today. I know you particularly traveled quite far to come here today, although John, I think you probably make the trip pretty regularly as well. Mm-hmm. So let's get right into the conversation. Maybe you could tell us each a little bit about your life and career and how it got to what you did prior to starting Solon. So Dave, why don't you start?
So immediately after my time at Ivey, I joined Credit Suisse First Boston in their financial sponsors coverage group in investment banking in New York. Did that for a couple of years and then moved to Blackstone where I was in their corporate private equity team in London, which was a great time to be there. It was just before the IPO. So a small team and a very sort of dynamic period for the organization. And then took a little bit of a hairpin turn and moved down to Freetown, Sierra Leone, where actually a fellow Ivey alumni, Kevin Coco, had nudged me towards a particular organization that Tony Blair was setting up after he left Downing Street, which became known as the Africa Governance Initiative. So spent just shy of 2 years working in State House there with the President's private sector advisor, trying to attract investment to the country and reform the investment climate to make it more attractive to investors. So that was the backstory for me until the starting of Solon.
Okay, Dave? Sorry, John?
Yeah, for me, upon graduating from the HBA program, started my career at Accenture, based here in Toronto, initially in the financial services strategy group, and then shortly after was fortunate to be part of the original team that set up Accenture's corporate VC group at the time, which was called New Businesses. So I spent the remainder of the 5.5 years at Accenture pre-Solon in Toronto and then in New York, but working primarily across sectors and globally, working with startups and making investments and working with management teams in sort of an entrepreneurial way, but all within the safety net, of course, and the resources and otherwise that a big company like Accenture would bring to bear. And then in 2009, made the more unconventional move from New York to Freetown, Sierra Leone to join Dave.
Okay, so quite traditional starts to your career, similar to a lot of Ivey grads, I would say. And then you made this great transition. So which one of you is going to spill the beans on how Solon came to be and whose idea was it and how did you create it and how did it all get going?
So maybe I'll start on that one. Like all of our better moves, it was very much at random initially. In this case, actually, it was while sitting in the dorm room in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where John and I were spending our last semester of Ivey on exchange, and I had a month to kill before moving to New York, and I, in a very cliched, ignorant way, just typed volunteer in Africa into Google, and wound up on the back of that teaching 5th and 6th grade math and science in a Liberian refugee camp in Ghana for a month before moving to New York. And as is often the case, when you move somewhere, you begin to build relationships. Realized that I couldn't teach math and science very well because none of the kids could read the notes on the board. So first began with a literacy program that sort of ran from afar while pursuing the career in New York. and London. And then that was sort of the original reason for leaving London, was to move back to sort of build out this organization in more of a charitable capacity, when got the nudge to instead do this time with the Tony Blair organization and work in State House. So that's what brought me to Freetown. And then I guess in terms of how that then converted into what became Solon, maybe I'll turn that over to John.
Yeah, I think it started with an invitation to go on vacation to Sierra Leone, which for me was a first. I'd been to Morocco, but other than that, I'd had no exposure to sub-Saharan Africa, and I thought, you know, why not? And traveled over there in September of 2009, and Dave and I did a pretty incredible trip, very unorganized, but nonetheless a true adventure from Freetown up to Timbuktu on the southern edge of the Sahara, of course, and that trip involved just about every mode of transportation you can imagine, from poda-podas, which are sort of mini buses, or matatus as they're maybe more popularly known in Kenya, to chartering motorbikes, to hitchhiking, to renting vehicles, to river boats up the Niger, and eventually on the backs of camels into the desert. And it was really throughout that trip that, for me at least, there was a quickly developing appreciation for the tremendous amount of opportunity that existed in the region, and of course the tremendous, similarly, number of challenges and gaps in the market that existed. And I'm not sure we could pinpoint the exact moment on that trip, but that's really when the idea around Solon and actually doing something and taking that next step with moving to Freetown. Dave's contract was coming to an end with Tony Blair's organization, and that's where it sort of took hold. So on return to Freetown, we left, parted ways, vacation was over, and I think a few weeks later from New York, another email went out saying, you know, I think we should do something here, and leave of absence, and traveled back to Freetown, and we worked on the business plan together in late 2009. And then over Christmas that year, sort of pulled the plug on the corporate career and moved to Freetown in early 2010 to join Dave and really set up Solon in the way many startups start, around the kitchen table in a shared house that we lived in with others that were working in the country as well.
And so, Dave, it seems like you had the itch for a long time to get involved in Africa and really sort of make a difference. John, when was the moment? When on that trip did you say, this is for me? Because it sounds like you weren't in the itch before you started Ivey program, but it sounds like you got there. What was it?
I think for me, I had always wanted to do something entrepreneurial. Okay. In high school, we set up a business in the cottage area around Peterborough, and painted houses and removed garbage and did sort of other unglamorous tasks of that nature. But I had the bug, I think, from there. And as I said, Accenture was a great opportunity to fulfill that to some extent and learn a lot. And once this opportunity arose in West Africa to not only sort of further pursue this entrepreneurial interest, but do it in a fascinating and new part of the world and in a way that has really important impact and helps solve fundamental problems, it addressed a lot of things that I think were important to us. So it was sometime throughout that journey and after the original trip to Sierra Leone that I think it became pretty clear that you're in your late 20s and not a whole lot tying you back, and this is a phenomenal opportunity to work with great people and do important work, so why not?
Okay. So you have the idea, you both leave corporate jobs. You were already with the Tony Blair organization, but you've convinced him now to leave his corporate job. You start working on this project. How do you know when it was successful? What were the first sort of green shoots that you were like, this is going to work?
Something that John and I have talked about a few times, and I think the the honest answer is we felt it was going to work before we started. And I think that any sort of entrepreneur has that sort of blind faith that this is going to be successful to a point of actual sense of certainty. And that's what actually drives the willingness to take that leap, and then also drives that sense of sort of perseverance that gets you through the long years of ups and downs that are to follow. Is that it might be down right now, but this is ultimately a successful endeavor. You will get there in the end if you just, keep up the effort along the way. So there was never sort of a single moment of thinking that it will become a success, because I think when we first sat down to write the business plan, we thought we had a winner.
Okay. Would you add anything? Any self-doubt, any time in that process where it was like,
Ongoing. No, it truly was just blind faith. It was a lot of enthusiasm, energy, excitement. I think we felt we had sort of the right skill set in many ways to undertake what we wanted to achieve, and it's been a journey, right? I think how you define success and whether it's actually worked is, maybe a question for another time, but I think we're proud of what we've achieved, but there's also 10, 20, 30 years ahead of us, and still have aspirations for continuing to grow Solon and our portfolio and new opportunities as well.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that question and a little bit more later on sort of what are your aspirations, but maybe just digging in a little bit more. It could have been a charity, but you didn't structure it just as a charity. You also structured it as an investment. Tell us a little bit about why you did what you did and what were you seeing?
Yeah, I think that charity and investment in all economies, there's very much a role for both, whether that's here in Canada or elsewhere. But I do think that in an African context and a West African context in particular, there are a lot of negative side effects when charity begins to play an outsized role. One is around the perceptions that it begins to create, both within donor communities and recipient communities. I think a lot of the misperceptions of Africa largely stem from this perception of it being in need of charity. And a lot of inaccuracies sort of grow from that. But then also we were seeing in some of these economies, which are quite small, just how outsized the NGO and charitable sector was becoming. So that you had kids in school, they're raising their hand of what do you want to be when you grow up, and it's not an engineer and an architect, it's I want to be an NGO worker. And the minute your country gets to that point, you're in for some challenges. And ultimately, our sense was what these countries really needed was they needed economic development. Like when I was working in government, the government of Sierra Leone was collecting $13 a head in tax revenue. And they had to build a social safety net, they needed to build the infrastructure, they needed to educate a population of which over almost 2/3 was under the age of 20 on $13 a head. It's just never going to work. Yeah. And the only way that you drive economic growth, especially if you don't have any sort of domestic capital base, is you need to attract investment. So we felt very strongly that if we could evidence that these are markets where you can generate an attractive return, if we could pilot new ways of approaching investment to generate returns in a way that others hadn't in the past, we could then stimulate sort of the flows of capital that these countries really need, and in the manner in which they need them, which is, as we say, more geared towards investment than charity. Again, not that charity has its role, but we felt that the role that we could play, especially given our backgrounds, was more on the investment side.
And Lisa talked a little bit about some of the companies that are part of the investment that you've developed. Did you start each of those, or did you actually look for partners in each of these areas? And if you did look for partners, what were sort of the criteria that you looked at in terms of where you would invest and grow?
So it was a combination. So our first business, the transportation company called Flash Vehicles, that was John and I, and our one other co-founder at Solon, Sean Ramanat, who had the idea, launched the business, just the three of us, and took it from there. Rising Academies was a former colleague from the Tony Blair organization who came to us with this idea. And then we wrote the $30,000 check to fund the business plan, and then actually my sister joined to help co-found that business as well. So we were there from the very start there. On the HC Capital Properties, I was more backing an established entrepreneur. We'd done some work in real estate, but then found just a fantastically capable and exciting partner, a gentleman named Sheikh Sanenkwa, and we've sort of combined our businesses and are largely riding his coattails to success, we hope, there. So it's been a bit of a blend in terms of when we sort of enter into these partnerships. But the main points, I think, of qualification are alignment on points of integrity as being the foremost, alignment on ambition. We're not doing this to make a small dent, but a big one. Yeah. And then just people that you want to spend time with, who are fun, who are irreverent, who are going to be humble, and not, you know, people that you want to be along for the ride with. Yep. I don't know, would you agree with that?
Yeah, entirely. I think going back to sharing a house and working around the kitchen table for the first 5 years, the bulk of our team lived, worked, socialized in very close quarters. And clearly that alignment on values and integrity and just the ability to get along in all different settings was crucial. And we, I think, still joke at how we managed to do that, because we certainly spent more time together, Dave and I and Sean and Arthur and others who joined the team thereafter, than I think you would in any other relationship, and certainly in a business context. So that fit is so critical, and it's difficult to screen for and identify. But I think, to Dave's point on sort of the longer term approach and the longevity of the ambition, by virtue of being in the markets where we operate now, Sheikh's a great example of somebody we have known for 6 years before we decided to back him. Or with West Africa Blue, our newest business in the conservation space, we had worked with Elizabeth Littlefield, who we co-founded the business with, for 6 years as well. So there's the ability and the opportunity to sort of build these relationships, test them, make sure they worked, and then by virtue of that kind of patient long-term approach, dive in once we felt it was ready and we were confident in that partnership.
Okay. You alluded to the plans for the future. Can you tell us a little bit about what's the ambition? Where do you want to go to next?
I mean, maybe I can start. I think the area that we focus on at the moment is really on how do we take what we have and amplify its growth, its impact. And I think we're fortunate to have a portfolio that is really doing great things and doing really well. And so our challenge to ourselves and our teams is, how do we take Rising Academies, for example, as Lisa mentioned, that touches 1,000 schools and almost 300,000 students. How do we take that to 1 million? How do we move from 5 countries to 10? How do we take that beyond sub-Saharan Africa to the global south? We have a small footprint in Pakistan at the moment as well, and so there's tremendous opportunity there where some of the challenges in education are similar, that a model like Rising's could be applied to. And I think the same applies to West Africa Blue, which is just under 2 years old, but we've been incredibly encouraged by the fact that there's this really inspiring mechanism through the carbon markets to help address climate change, protect biodiversity, have a profound multi-decade impact on communities, and among the most isolated and poorest communities in the world, and maybe most importantly, do it sustainably through the sale of high quality credits that creates a recurring revenue stream and breaks that sort of dependency on sort of any external involvement. So I think with West Africa Blue and our network on the ground, we're really excited about the pipeline to take Blue from the 3 projects that it is today, anchored in Sierra Leone, similarly to a much larger scale. And the goal there is 1 million acres under conservation from the about 250,000 that we have currently. And I think other examples exist within the portfolio with HC Capital Properties and others as well. But then there's the level up at Solon and what our ambitions are there.
Yeah, I think one of the exciting things for us actually comes from probably a fairly sobering reality for all of us, which is that we're in this moment of sort of existential crises on a number of fronts, whether that's climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, frankly, even like a demographic crisis where you have rapidly aging and shrinking populations in more and more places in the world. And the reality is that the answers to a lot of these crises are beginning to very much intersect with the regions in which we operate. So if you want to address climate, the nature-based solutions that are going to get you there, the minerals that are going to get you on your EV transitions, that brings you to our part of the world. If you're going to address biodiversity crises and loss, that brings you to our part of the world. And if you're going to address the demographic challenges, like as it is today, 1 out of 3 kids in the world are born in Africa. Within 25 years, it's going to be 40%. When the rest of the world is shrinking, this is the last area where populations are growing. And right now, one of the primary challenges is they're not being given the quality of education that they need. So a lot of these sort of themes and risks of global significance really intersect with where we are and what we're able to achieve and hopefully address. And thankfully, that gives a great alignment between the business ambition and the impact ambition, because the greatest, frankly, business opportunities are in these elements or areas where the impact opportunities also of global scale, which is really exciting for us.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what's happening in most of North America, Europe, anywhere north of the equator, in fact, population age is rising dramatically. We all need immigration to actually drive what we're going to do, and this is sort of the engine for the future. And so the best place to be making the investment in the next generation is absolutely critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I find this incredibly inspiring, and I know many of the people in the audience likely are feeling similar to me. How would you, if people are interested, I'd just be curious, what's ways that we can get involved, that we can help? What are things that you need to be successful, and how can the Ivey connection help?
I think it maybe goes without saying, but to reiterate, we've been so fortunate to benefit from the Ivey connection from the very, very beginning, right? As Dave mentioned, our initial introduction to Sierra Leone was through an Ivey grad who was a year ahead of us. And since then, our very first investors, our advisors, our supporters have all been people from within the Ivey network, in many cases, people from our section in HBA. And I think that has certainly been a key to the progress that we've made to date. So that Ivey network has been incredibly important. I think we're very grateful for that, and grateful for those people in particular for their support and patience and resilience along the journey with us. But there's lots more, of course, we can do. And this is a phenomenal opportunity, and we're really honored to be here to tell this story. And we tell it in different contexts, speaking to investors, and certainly in West Africa with our stakeholders there. But to share it with the Ivey community, to share it in Canada, I think is something that we're excited to be a part of. And I know there's more that we can do as well. We have a Canadian registered charity that sponsors students at Rising Academies to pursue the high school education. Most of those students come from the Turtle Islands, an incredibly remote area that has some of the poorest populations in Sierra Leone and as a result the world. And they also do work in healthcare. It's called the Solon Foundation. So that's a one option, but I think there's certainly more.
Yeah, I'd echo that, both first on that point about the value of the Ivey network for us, in that I think every entrepreneurial venture goes through periods of near-death existential risk, and for us, both the port of final call when it came to providing money to keep us afloat, but also words of comfort and counsel to get us through, that was invariably, well, many of the people in this room, actually, for which we owe a great debt. And in terms of how that, I think, can evolve going forward, it really is those two, in a sense, really three ways. One being if all that sort of works for people is sort of the charitable route, there is a role for that, and that's something that, for instance, we can help facilitate. But really what we feel that these markets require is investment, and if folks are willing to engage in putting capital at risk in these markets, I think that that's exactly what's needed. And then putting time at risk. And again, that can be various levels given on the individual involved. Obviously, for us, we went all in, and it's kind of 100% of the time commitment, but with a group as capable as this, clearly, just a couple percentage points of that time allocation can really move the needle. So I think it's sort of dependent on the individual. As long as you have the intent, there's a way that you can make it work.
Okay. Coming out of today's session, I think we're going to post on the main Ivey page a little bit more about how different individuals can get involved in different ways. Because, I mean, I think there's, as you said, there's three really great ways, and we should be encouraging people to the extent that this is inspiring for them to get engaged. So for everybody in the audience, just a little advertisement on that. I'm going to go to a rapid fire question round. More fun. ChatGPT. Game changer or just a fad?
Game changer.
Game changer.
Okay. Do you prefer books or podcasts?
Books.
Podcasts.
Your favorite one? What's the one you're doing right now?
Recent favorite was Think Again by Adam Grant. Strongly recommend.
Okay.
Lex Friedman, long form interviews in depth.
Wow, you guys are super scholarly in the way you do this. And this is from me. What was your most memorable case at Ivey? And you can't say the one we were just talking about.
I'll say one that I actually never took, but I happen to know the author of, and some of the names in it are also members of the Solon team. It's called Arthur Rojas, which was a case Mary Heiss taught.
Okay.
I actually don't know what the case was called, but 12 Angry Men. So we watched the classic Henry Fonda film in like little bits, and you watched Henry Fonda be able to sway a room of 12 angry men from the wrong decision to the right one. That's great.
Okay. Leafs fan or Blue Jays fan?
Calgary Flames.
Good answer.
I'm a very controversial hockey fan with friends and family. Grew up loving the Habs, but the Leafs need everything they can get from us at the moment, so I'll say Leafs.
Okay, and you think the Leafs are going to win the series?
Yes.
There's that blind faith of the entrepreneur again.
So you don't. How about Edmonton? It's kind of close to Calgary.
That is.
That's
but
like
it's
the
so
arch
painful.
rivalry,
Yeah,
isn't
yeah.
it?
It's like cheering for this. Anyway.
Yeah. And, well, we're out of time, but it was a real pleasure hearing your story, and I'm so, so excited that you are the alumni recipients this year. I mean, it's an incredible story, and I hope everyone in the room feels as inspired as I do about what you guys have done, and also I hope we're able to create a lot of energy with people to get engaged and to help you continue to be successful. So thank you for taking the time today, and congratulations again.